So next month will be Black History Month. And we know that so-called Black history, which is just a corporate title, Black is not a race, it's not a nationality, it's a color. You don't identify your existence based on the melanin, carbon rich, whatever you want to call it. You don't base your existence on your skin tone or your hue. You see, through the Indo-Europeans, through their doctrines, I think it was Frederick Fluenberg, he curated the classes based upon the skin tones. So this racism that they created, because in the ancient days, they went by the tribal names, the nationalities, the Egyptians, the Jews, the real ones, the Moors, the Arabs, the Etruscans, the real Greeks, which were people of color. Now what you see on these fake movies like Gladiator.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
And many other titles. So they went by, the nationality. It wasn't the form of, oh, you're lighter, you're darker, etc. That was created by the Europeans. And then they venerate certain religions or societies that they find valuable. I mean, if you really think about it, they venerate the Egyptian culture, the Hermetics, the Kemetic, what they venerate in Egypt. So in the movies, they portray them as white people. But then you have biblical scholars, like in the compact Zondervan Bible, they'll tell you that the Negroes are not of the Hamitic line, but they are the dark-skinned races, the Ethiopians, the Cushites, etc. Those are the lineage of Ham. But they won't mention that the Negroes are of the Shemitic line. They leave that out. I find that quite interesting. I've been finding that quite interesting for years. Why the big secrecy? It's not really a secret no more. I mean, truth be told, it's out there. It's just like with the so-called black nobility rulership in England or Europe, Scotland, Ireland, etc., the Wales, Germany. The original inhabitants were dark-skinned people of color. And even their old scholars from the 18th, 17th century, they knew this. It was quite the interesting find. But, through media, white rulership or supremacy, whatever you want to call it, a lot of these people have believed that they have created societies through centuries when that's not even the case. You got to look at the spiritual aspect. If they put this type of information into the mainstream media, it would mess up a lot of people's minds. And I say that because you got to look at the slave narrative that was fed through different generations, my parents, grandparents, etc. That slave narrative, black is associated with slavery, which is not the case. The Slav slave is associated with Russia, which is associated to so-called white folks. But even the black scholars, some of them are paid to push these certain agendas to fit the slave narrative, especially with the surnames, and that we all came from plantations. And truth be told, there were Negro slave owners too, who had a lot of slaves. They won't talk about that. But I will. I'm going to read from this book, Creole New Orleans, Race and Americanization, page 204, Black Creoles and Americans. From the beginning of the 19th century, race relations in New Orleans had puzzled American newcomers. So who were the newcomers? Most likely Indo-Europeans or immigrants, particularly those who were set to govern the city in 1803. but it wasn't slaves, which people associate with black people, in slavery. Slavery didn't end until 1865. That is the narrative that they always teach in these miseducation schools. Okay. The new rulers encountered a black majority. You hear that? A black majority that grew larger with the addition of French-speaking West Indian immigrants. More perhaps than its size, the nature of the city's black population, particularly those who were free, confused and frightened American officials. So when it uses that word frightened, that's mostly indicating they frightened the Indo-Europeans, the so-called Caucasians or white men. Free black Creoles of New Orleans had emerged from French and Spanish rule not only with unusual rights and powers, but also with a particular assertiveness and self-confidence. Many were armed and had gained military training and experience in the official militias of Louisiana. You see, they knew the importance of military and training, and they were armed. They weren't holding signs and saying, love your enemy. Do you see the difference? It's just like in that movie, American Skin. He wanted to make a point after the cop killed his son. So what did he do? They got up there with their guns and they wanted to get justice because this justice system is corrupt. Okay. They had also secured wealth and had a firm foothold in skilled occupations normally closed to free persons of African ancestry in Anglo-America. Most may have been fair-skinned, but not all. They ran the spectrum of skin color, which means swarthy, tawny, dark skin. Those were the words back in those days that they used to describe people of color, different shades of carbon-rich or melanin. In the urban setting of New Orleans, moreover, free black men and women intermingled with slaves, often living in the same quarters and intermarrying cohabiting with those still in bondage. So in 1803, was there Jim Crow? Was every so-called black man a slave? See, they curated the Jim Crow, of course, in 1877, but also they created this paradigm based on what you look like of your skin tone, like in the movie American Skin. So now I'm going to read page 205. New American officials soon faced the self-confidence of free black Creole leaders of the city who felt that the Louisiana Purchase Treaty had assured them of equal citizenship in the United States even before the transfer to the American authority. The explosive events of the revolutions in France and Haiti had raised the aspirations of black New Orleans for equality and freedom. Now, I'm going to read this. It's very important. When they petitioned for civil rights, American leaders showed no desire to perpetuate, much less extend, the rights of black Louisianians. Instead, the new rulers tried to impose their own American racial order on New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana. In the rural Louisiana countryside, little may have distinguished the severity of the Anglo-American slave order from that of the French or Spanish. But in New Orleans, American authorities face a severe challenge to the racial policies that they wish to establish. You know why? Here's why. The new American governor, William C.C. Calburn, made no overt move against the armed, I repeat, armed, free black population. Okay? That's why they want to take away your guns. They want to take away certain rights. Yeah, they fear black people with weapons. Okay? Faced with possibilities of insurrection, like they did in that Capitol, feces shitting everywhere, by either slaves or some of the non-American white inhabitants, he and his associates tried to avoid creating any additional enemies. I like to say with that insurrection that happened, I believe that was a psyop. I believe that was staged to set an agenda, but also I like to say what I read here. It says the William C.C. Calhoun made no overt move against the armed free black population. So let's switch it if that was black people. And then, okay, faced with the possibilities of an insurrection by either slaves or some of the non-American white inhabitants, he and his associates tried to avoid creating any additional enemies. So if there was weapons involved, it would have been a massacre, a shootout. Yes, you had a couple of people that got killed, but still, was that really insurrection? I believe not. Back to page 205. Time and events only compounded their ambivalence, their reverberations of the slave revolts in Saint Domingue brought more French-speaking black settlers into the territory. By 1810, the free Negro population of the city rose to 4,950 from 1,566 in 1805, and the slave population rose to 5,961 from 3,105. Among the West Indian newcomers were even more skilled, better educated, and probably more assertive leaders, both free and slave, than those who had already disturbed the Americans in 1803. Pressed by fearful white Creoles and Americans, keyword fearful white Creoles and Americans, the territorial government thinned the ranks of the free black militia, imposed white officers, and finally allowed the legislature to band it. So now I'm going to be reading from the book, The 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. Slavery. The word slave was originally applied to white people. It comes from Slav, a Russian people captured by the Germans. Now we know in modern times, through racial and prejudice teachings and doctrines, that they associate so-called black people with slavery. That's the first thing that comes to the consciousness of people's mind. Black equals slavery, but that's not the case. Okay. Now I'm going to go to number 65. Between 1526 and 1859, there were 33 slave revolts in the United States, one of which was headed by Nat Turner of Virginia in 1831. With only 6 companions, Nat Turner set out to free 3 million slaves. The United States Marines and 2 warships were sent against him after he had killed 55 whites and captured several plantations. The Seminoles, or runaways of mixed Indian and Negro descent of Florida, fought 3 wars with the United States to preserve their freedom. They didn't hail signs. They actually fought for their freedom. They didn't beg the government to give them equal rights to people who don't look at them the same. That's a difference. So the word Seminole means runaway or fugitive. The Seminoles were chiefly fugitive Indians and Negro slaves and corresponded to the Maroons of Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, and South America. They fought 3 wars with the United States. That's why you look at those sports teams. You see the Redskins or the Florida State Seminoles. They're all dark-skinned, okay? There were no white Indians. All right, number 69. In 1860, there were 487 free Negroes in the United States, some of whom owned slaves. C.D. Wilson estimates that there were 6,230 Negro slaveholders. The tax returns of Charleston, South Carolina for 860 show 132 Negro slaveholders with 390 slaves. The Negro slaveholders, like the white ones, fought to keep the chattels in the Civil War. Now I'm going to go to 69, the proof. The U.S. Census of 1790 showed 195 Negro slaveholders, of whom 6 were in Connecticut and 9 in New York. In 1830, there were about 4,500 Negro slaveholders. In 1836, slaves owned by Negroes in New Orleans numbered 640. On the Negro slave holders, see Popular Science Monthly, October 1912. C.G. Woodson, Free Negro Owners of Slaves, gives the names of the slaveholders. You see? So not everyone was a so-called slave or a black slave. You had white slaves too. Now I'm going to go back to that book, Creole New Orleans, Race and Americanization, see what the scholars say. Because there's some people don't believe this, but there's 2 different scholars, 2 different people, one black, one white. Let's see what they say. So I'm going to be reading from page 207. Slowly but surely, the existing rights of the free black population were eroded. The Territorial Assembly's purpose was clear when it declared free people of color ought never insult or strike white people, nor presume to conceive themselves equal to whites. So why is it 2021 and we want equality when they never viewed us as equal to them? You can't view yourself equal to someone if they don't look at you the same or they think less of you. That's just common sense, okay? To guard the color line, the Assembly ordered that racial designation be applied to all persons of African ancestry in every public document. Let me read that again. To guard the color line, the Assembly ordered that racial designation be applied to all persons of African ancestry in every public document.
You are. Can I just end with this one thing? These four brothers sitting here, we didn't all come from Africa. Ding! And there was there was a country before 1492, and our history goes way beyond 1492. So you can't start us at 1492. We were always here. We were always here. We were always here.
So you had a large chunk of so-called blacks already here in the Americas, which is the black, Palo, indigenous, Negroes, different tribes that were already here. You had the influx of the black Europeans fleeing the wars, the 30-year wars over there in Europe, famine, plagues, religious wars. You had King James, a so-called black man, going up against Oliver Cromwell in the Jacobite wars. And then you had the West African Judeans, the Yehudi, Negro land, the Jews of the British map. I think it's 1747. So they know this. It's just our people don't know this. So there's three phenotypes or three archetypes. And that's a confusion. And one has to do their own research and find out who you are. All right. From 1815 to 1830, state officials did not further reduce free black rights. An economic boom in the city enabled skilled black workers and merchants to improve their already impressive occupational status. When a repressive mood returned in the 1830s following the revived abolition movement and the Nat Turner insurrection, Creole white lawmakers still had enough power in the state legislature to exempt many of the free black Creoles from increased restrictions by giving special status to those who were in Louisiana at some earlier date. More significant, most of the black Creoles of New Orleans, both free and slaves, escaped much of the renewed severity by living within virtually anonymous Creole municipal districts of New Orleans that were created in 1836, where enforcement of almost all laws were notoriously lax, which means not strict. As a result, free enslaved black Creoles continued to gather for festivals, frequent bars and dance halls, and cohabit despite the state laws designed to constrain such activities. Now, this will be the last couple pages I'm going to read from this book. I thought this was quite interesting. This is page 209. Like other white Americans who moved out to the western frontier, the immigrants to Louisiana passed laws to keep free black Americans from entering their new settlements. And kind of like today, where there's certain restrictions, or you got to make a certain amount of income. You can't pay the taxes to keep certain demographics out of the more high-end neighborhoods. Despite the remarkable success of white leaders in other states, however, Louisianans failed in their efforts to keep out or effectively expel free black Americans. So I'm going to read from page 210, the two highlighted sections that I thought were quite interesting. The increase in the number of free black Americans was in part a result of American slaves gaining their freedom after arriving in New Orleans under the lenient manumission laws that survived from the colonial days of the city. Surprisingly, large numbers of free black Americans also came to New Orleans voluntarily. So you had a lot of Negro slave holders as well, okay, and white ones as well. So it wasn't no Jim Crow, no segregation. You know, they didn't care whether you was black or white, you was a slave. For the most part, they came to work on coasting vessels or river steamers. Ship owners in need of compliant, cheap labor recruited them and even helped them evade state laws and city ordinances passed to exclude them. The lure of jobs in the city's relatively open racial order made it an island of freedom and opportunity in the deep South. Wow. And they set the South back in those days. See, you know, a lot of the history here in America is so narrative. You know, you got to question everything that you read because everything wasn't the same in different states or different territories. You actually had them getting along, you know, but from the movies, the artistic license, from museums, art, you would think otherwise. Okay. So this is the last section I'm going to read. So many fugitive slaves fled into the city that their presence began to undermine distinctions between the free and the slave in New Orleans. But their status proved to be very precarious and probably led to the harassment of many blacks who were legally free because their underpaid and undermanned police force won private bounties for recovering runaways. The fugitives had a much more difficult time avoiding apprehension than did free black aliens. During the 1850s, more than 8,500 fugitives fell into the hands of the police. No wonder they created the prison industrial system. Okay. Most had escaped from neighboring plantations, but slave residents in the city also made at least 2,000 attempts to escape bondage during that decade. So you had your free blacks or aliens, and then you had your fugitive slaves that fled the plantations. You know, it's no different than today, you know, whether a so-called black man, there's nothing on his record, he gets stopped and, you know, they racial profile him because they're looking for criminals because in their mindset, they look or view black as criminals. Even in the movie American Skin, you know, they're alluding to the same thing. And we've just seen so many senseless killings based on these racial ideologies. And look, history repeats itself. There's nothing new under the sun. What they went through back then, we are still going through today, you know, with the so-called justice and the law, okay, where they lied and said that all men are created equal, which we know that is a lie. But peace and shalom.
Say Jewish, yo. Sorry, I just said I'll come to the realization, you know what I'm saying, some years back, you know what I'm saying, that you know, who we call African Americans here in this country is the descendants of the biblical Hebrew Israelites.